Right, Jess, what are you writing in your journal?
Well, Robbie, Elon Musk, in his conversation with Donald Trump on X Spaces, said something that has economists, financial experts, and really anyone who understands money pulling our hair out. Take a listen.
A lot of people just don't understand where inflation comes from. Inflation comes from government overspending because the checks never bounce when it's written by the government. So if the government spends far more than it brings in, that increases the money supply. And if the money supply increases faster than the rate of goods and services, that's inflation.
Yes, Elon, the U.S. economy is actually very simple. Thank you for that. It's just like how I ate ice cream while at the beach this weekend. Ice cream that had sprinkles on it, and now I have a sunburn, and that is because eating ice cream with sprinkles on it causes a sunburn. Maybe, to a child that doesn't understand the sun yet, that would be a convincing argument, and that is how Elon Musk sounds to people who pay attention to inflation and the economy. By the way, numbers out today show that inflation has fallen below 3%, the first time the rate was this low since 2021. But dudes like Elon are the reason I studied economics at all. My dad was a carpenter, and when the housing market crashed, thanks to risky decisions by greedy bankers trying to turn money into more money by just moving it around, we struggled to keep our home. My dad built homes from scratch with his own two hands for a living, and Wall Street was bailed out in the billions, but we nearly lost our home. To me, that didn't make sense. I wanted to figure out why our economy works like that and why people in power let it happen. Elon doesn't make much sense here either, because what he says just doesn't match with the data. So let's see precisely what the data shows. In June of 2022, we saw inflation reach 9%. That is a rate that is 3 times higher than it was when Biden first took office. When we compare the first quarter of 2020 to the rate of inflation in 2022, we also find that it was over 5 times higher in Lithuania, Ireland, Finland, Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, and over 10 times higher in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, and over 20 times higher in Greece and Israel. So, how did Joe Biden pull that off? Saying Joe Biden and the U.S. Congress, by authorizing spending via financial stimulus legislation, caused global inflation would be like if when I went back home to Iowa and I saw that my flower garden was flooded and I got mad at my boyfriend for overwatering the soil, and then I noticed our neighbor Mark's garden is flooded too, and so is our other neighbor Pearl's, and actually so is everyone's garden in the entire neighborhood, because it turns out he didn't overwater the flowers in our yard. It rained today. At the beginning of the pandemic, supply chains broke down and many people got sick. Bosses adopted social distancing guidelines in their warehouses and factories and packing plants so that their workers didn't all catch COVID and slow output of goods even further. The results of this and policies like this was decreased supply and higher prices. Remember how the shelves looked during the first year of the pandemic? It's not that. The American Rescue Plan was signed, and then the American people, with their extra cash, could finally splurge on toilet paper and SpaghettiOs. That's not to say it's impossible for the U.S. government to overspend. It's just not what caused inflation. I do not believe the U.S. government can put an infinite amount of dollars into the economy without consequences. It's important where the money goes, how much is spent, and when. That is why economists measure inflationary conditions. For example, the output gap. That is a measure for the difference in aggregate demand, or the total demand for goods and services in our entire economy, and the productive capacity of our economy. And that measurement is to make sure that we aren't in a position where too many dollars are chasing too few goods. Now, critics of the American Rescue Plan claimed that it would be too much spending and it would create a positive output gap. Too many dollars chasing too few goods, that would lead to inflation. The economists who warned of inflation saw this, the output gap, as the empirical test for overspending. And at the end of 2020, the output gap was negative. At 4%, still, by the end of the third quarter of 2021, it remained negative at about negative 1.7%. So this is even as inflation jumped up considerably. The spending did not create a scenario where too many dollars were chasing too few goods, as Elon Musk said happened. This is just a fact. When the output gap is positive, too many dollars are chasing too few goods. The source of the problem, though, it's not always on the demand side. We focus maybe too much on blaming the too many dollars portion as the source of inflation. Sure, the government can mess up the economy by adding too many dollars, but they can also mess it up by making policy decisions that reduce supply. The too few goods problem might be overlooked. In an inflationary period, people overanalyze government spending, even when the data shows it's not the cause. People discuss taking away dollars through taxes, halting government spending and public programs, and reducing wages. That would all be reducing the demand for goods and services, the dollars chasing them. But they overlook the other half of the equation. They could increase supply of goods and services. If banks and investors aren't loaning as much money out to people who will invest in existing businesses or people who will start new ones, we will see a reduction in supply. The US government can always step in and make investments on the supply side. They could start with something we aren't producing very well now and something there's high demand for, like computer chips, for example. This kind of government spending prevents recessions. And for some reason, despite the multiple financial collapses in my lifetime, people don't get scared when banks are tasked with deciding when and how dollars enter the economy. That's insane to me, because while in my lifetime I've experienced multiple financial collapses thanks to the risks taken by Wall Street, the US government has never defaulted on a treasury bond payout. Elon's criticism of the government is that they overspent to cause inflation. Meanwhile, Trump added $7.8 trillion to the debt, but we didn't see high inflation under Trump. And what did the government do to contribute to inflation? Not overspend, like Elon said. And to be clear, it was not Joe Biden. It was the Trump-appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. The Fed intentionally constrained supply. Since the 70s, productivity has increased by 64.7%. Workers' pay has only increased by 14.8%. I cannot stress enough how insane it is that the people who use their own hands to do the work to keep our economy running are not compensated fairly for it. Again, it didn't used to be this way. We can look at how things changed over time. Look how much smaller of a slice of the pie workers are getting over time since the 1950s. Again, they're not being paid less because they're being less productive. They're exponentially more productive. This is hourly productivity since 1950. Again, compare that to today. In America, we believe this thing, that if you work harder, you do better, not worse. These two metrics of productivity and pay should increase in tandem. Something is terribly broken in our economy, and the people in charge refuse to fix it because at a time when wages had been stagnant for 50 years and workers are being more productive than ever before, Jerome Powell said workers are the problem.
People can get paid well. It's too hot. You know, it's unsustainably hot, but notwithstanding that, it's a very, very good labor market for workers. And it's our job to get it into a better place.
Jerome Powell decided to raise interest rates. That means it will be more expensive to get a loan because businesses will have to pay a higher percent of it back to the bank. So less people will start businesses and invest in existing ones. They'll hire less and lay off staff. There will be less jobs, and workers will be willing to take jobs for lower wages and less likely to ask for additional benefits, knowing they can be easily replaced, and wages, therefore, will go down. They could have, instead, increased supply if they thought demand was too high, but they never approach it that way. Instead, the plan is usually to make working people poorer.
Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an
just a math
intended
problem.
consequence. It's
Well,
not.
but it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs. People who are working right now, making their mortgages.
Make people unemployed on purpose. But Elon won't talk about that because he's a billionaire. And this kind of policy benefits people who like wages low so their profits can be high. Interest rates have also contributed to inflation. Corporations can more easily afford high interest rates compared to small and medium-sized businesses. So while many mom and pop shops struggle, corporate profits are at a record high. They have less competition. They can set prices even higher, and they have. In 2020, corporate profits were at $2.4 trillion. At the end of 2023, $3.2 trillion. Just for a visual, look here. This is what corporate profits after taxes have looked like since 1960. For the past 30 years, only 11.4% of money made off of price increases went to corporate profits. During the pandemic, 53.9% of money made off of price increases went to corporate profits. Input costs only increased 12% during the pandemic. So this was not caused by a higher cost of doing business. The 30 years before the pandemic, 62% of money made off of price increases went to workers' wages. During the pandemic, only 8% did. Now, inflation is a measure of price changes over time. If corporations, who now have a greater market share, are raising prices because they want to increase profits, that is literally measured as inflation. While companies are raking in profit, they don't want to use their own money to invest in growth. They'd rather do stock buybacks and increase returns to shareholders. They'd rather not take on loans they'd rather take on loans than reinvest their profit. But because of the high interest rate environment, that capital to invest in businesses came at a higher cost than they were willing to pay. So a lot of these companies started reducing the quality or the quantity of their products, but selling them for the same price. But now they would have lower input costs. Companies also like showing growth on their quarterly reports, but again, when interest rates are high, they don't want to invest more in creating a product of higher value. So they didn't, and increased prices anyway for the same exact stuff. But don't take my word for it. Here's John Castimedes, who's the president of 2 supermarket chains. He's also an oil and real estate CEO.
You know how CEOs are on Wall Street. They live quarter by quarter. If they're off by a penny in earnings, Wall Street is not forgiven. So what are the CEOs doing? They're raising prices.
They were saying the quiet part out loud through this whole thing. On a balance sheet, revenue increases from higher prices looks like growth, and that satisfies Wall Street investors. But for consumers at the store, it means higher prices. It means struggling to feed your family. And at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it is inflation. If the high interest rates are good for companies' balance sheets, things should be good on Wall Street, right? Why did the stock market go haywire on Monday of last week? Well, high interest rates are good for a key actor in our economy, the banks. Not Burbank. My family lives in a tiny house in rural North Carolina, and my parents live off of Social Security. Banks that loan money out and make money off of interest payments. They have been doing quite well. They rake it in during high interest rate periods. Banks also take the money and turn it into more money through investments. That's important because now that we are years into interest rate hikes, we're also seeing the real impact of slow job growth. The jobs report in July showed 114,000 jobs were added to the economy, which is much less than people expected. This means the Fed could say mission accomplished, and then interest rates will come back down. That would mean less money coming in for banks and less investment going out. The banks may no longer be bolstering the stock market, so people freaked out. And it's annoying that the economy is only considered bad when rich people have a harder time turning their money into more money without doing any work whatsoever, but that's how it is. So at the onset of the pandemic, when the forecast for investment was uncertain, Financial stimulus prevented a recession. You need money to make money. No one's going to wake up and go to work for $0. You have to pay workers, buy land, machinery, and tools to produce goods and services, to grow the economy. The dollars have to come from somewhere. If not banks or investors, the public sector can put dollars into the economy without it being inflationary. The government investing capital in things like revamping infrastructure was a good move. It prevented stagnation in the economy. It prevented a recession. Billionaires like Elon Musk just get mad when economic policy making for a brief moment benefits the economy as a whole, not just the ruling class of investors, owners, and executives. After all, he knows himself that government spending isn't always inflationary and is sometimes good and productive. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken a $465 million loan from the government in 2010 or taken in $9 billion in revenue from the carbon credit program. But don't take advice from the economy from anyone who's had a vested interest in working people getting paid less or paying higher prices. Elon and I can agree on one thing.
A lot of people just don't understand where inflation comes from.
Agree that Elon Musk might not understand where inflation comes from.
I mean, does he not, though? So you agree that government spending can contribute to inflation sometimes.
It can, but it didn't. And the real constraints
In 2022?
Right.
I mean, I think most analyses conclude that it did. I'm reading one from MIT from, this is not my area of expertise, clearly, so I'm just looking for high-quality sources. Mark Kritzman of MIT writes that 40% of inflation in the 2022 spike specifically was attributed to government spending. It was by far the most likely explanation.
They have no way of calculating that. There's no way of knowing where price increases come from. You can't interview a CEO and say, why are you raising prices? Oh, it's because there's more dollars in the economy because the government overspent. There's a human decision maker at every corporation that says, yeah, we're going to raise prices. When you have the federal government,
obviously the people who literally decide what the price is are, I guess, the most, but
I am talking about the root cause.
Okay, but the analysis is that they did that because of the government spending.
No. So when you have the U.S. government decreasing supply, that's a key factor in the equation of increased demand. The United States government, if they're not investing dollars in having our economy at full productive capacity, if banks and businesses are not allocating loans towards growing our economy, then we can enter a situation where too many dollars are chasing too few goods, even without any spending. If it was the case that any additional dollars in the U.S. economy caused inflation, we would have seen rampant inflation under Trump when the debt was increased by over $7 trillion. We didn't see that. And so it does matter where the money goes. Spending money into the economy at a time when you're constraining supply can be inflationary, but they had no reason to constrain supply, and businesses could have been investing if it was a lower interest rate environment. So to slow the growth of the economy while adding additional dollars to it is an issue. A lot of the dollars that were added to the economy actually went to increasing productive capacity over time through things like the CHIPS Act and the American Infrastructure Bill.
All right, well, you let us know what you think about that, viewers. We'll have more Rising right after this.